Then, hi, good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome to the 2024 edition of the Sustainable Enterprise Webinar Series by Enterprise Ireland. My name is Ankush Shirsar, and I'm the executive in the Sustainability and Renewable Energy Department of Enterprise Ireland. I'm also joined by my colleague, Owen Murray. Today, he'll be handling the proceedings in the background. We're delighted to host this Sustainable Enterprise Webinar Series, and today, we're hosting our first webinar focusing on the sustainability data quality in collaboration with Energy Elephant. Earlier this year, we hosted the Green Transition webinar series focusing on several aspects of sustainability, including how to develop a sustainability strategy and plan, sustainability standards, net zero guidelines, scope 3 emission measurement. Those webinars are available on our website in on-demand section, and link for those webinars will be shared later. So once again, you're very welcome to our webinar today if you're joining us just now. Just to note, the webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Enterprise Ireland website in the on-demand sections of the webinar. There will be space for Q&A towards the end of today's webinar. So in Enterprise Ireland, sustainability is a key pillar of our own strategy, and we are working to support our clients to reduce their carbon emissions, but equally to address the wider sustainability space and incorporate the sustainability into business strategy. And therefore, the purpose of this whole webinar series is to reach out to our clients, to our stakeholders, and to our colleagues to raise awareness around very broad range of initiatives, support, and activities that falls into this sustainability space that we are so very focused on. Today, we are talking specifically about sustainability data quality, as businesses are coming under increased pressure to show how they are improving their business sustainability performance. Enterprise Ireland has a wide range of training, consultancy, and capital investment supports that are all aimed at helping companies to get started and accelerate the sustainability and decarbonization journey. More information on the Enterprise Ireland sustainability support is available on the website, and we'll share the link to supports available along with today's webinar and slides. Any clients on the webinar today, they can just contact the development advisor for more details on those sustainability supports, or any clients from local enterprise office or IDA joining us today for the webinar can definitely contact their relevant agencies for more details on the supports available. So the agenda for today is that we will hear from Joe Borza of Energy Elephant on sustainability data quality, and we will also hear from an EI client company about how data can help achieve resource and cost reduction targets. We have the time at the end for Q&A, so at any time during the presentation and panel discussion, please put your questions in the chat function and we will address those at the end. Just before we move on to the webinar itself, I would like to highlight the Enterprise Ireland Sustainability Kickstarter Workshop Initiative. It's a 3-hour online workshop aimed at SME business leaders to help them understand the principles of sustainability and ESG and equip them with the practical skills to embed those principles into business strategy. It is designed to be an interactive session with breakout rooms, collaboration with peers across the sectors, and ample opportunity for Q&A and action planning. It's a free workshop for EI and Leo clients, and participant at the end of the workshop will walk away with the action plan. Schedule and details for the registration are available on EI website, but on your screen now, you can see the upcoming schedule for this Kickstarter workshop. So without further ado, I suppose we will kick off with what we are here to talk about today. So I would like to introduce you to our speaker, Joe Borza of Energy Elephant. So chartered engineer and Dublin native, Joe is the CEO and co-founder of Energy Elephant, a pioneering cloud-based platform that inspires and helps large companies, SMEs, and multi-site organizations around the world to make a better energy and sustainability decisions using the data. Under Joe's leadership, Energy Elephant established itself as one of Ireland's fastest growing sustainability tech startup, and the company has earned multiple awards and accolades, including being the only Irish firm on the prestigious 2023 SET 100 list of top climate tech startups globally. Joe holds an engineering and management degree from Trinity College Dublin and a master's in sustainable development from Technological University Dublin. We are also joined by James Kelleher of Kerry, Ireland. James is the head of finance operations at Kerry Dairy Ireland, with a 10 years plus experience in senior people management. So welcome, Joe, and welcome, James, for today's webinar. So Joe, I'll hand it over to you then. Thank you.
Thanks, Ankush, and thanks very much for having us today. I hope everyone's keeping well and enjoying the good weather while Ireland has it. I was saying I'd be surprised if we have too many on the webinar today because the Ploughing Championships is obviously chock-a-block with people, hopefully anyway, and with all the good weather. So I'm just going to share my screen and just double check you guys can see the slides okay. And if you could just give me a thumbs up, Ankush, if that's okay, everyone can see it. Good stuff.
Yeah, they're just loading there and you're on the presenter's mode. So you're good to go. Thanks.
Thanks, Ankush. So yeah, look, today's webinar is around sustainability data, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm hoping that kind of explains some of the areas we're going to cover. And then I'll have a short panel discussion with James in Kerry afterwards as well. So just talking about some of the things and challenges that organizations are facing in this particular area at the moment, as well as kind of the high level stuff, but also the low level things. So as Ankush mentioned, I'm the co-founder of Energy Elephant. I'm an engineer by background, but worked in the area of sustainability now for nearly 20 odd years. I did a master's in sustainable development back in 2004. It was the only sustainability management course that was available in Ireland at the time. But it's amazing to see so many courses now being available to students in this particular topic, because it's obviously a very topical area for everybody. So as mentioned, the kind of welcome and introduction, I'm going to go through some of the key data challenges that we've seen for organizations. I'm going to cover the good, the bad, and the ugly in that order. And then James and myself are going to have a short discussion just around some of the kind of challenges that organizations have. And then, as Ankush mentioned, I'll pass it back to him just to run through some Q&A. So if you have any questions, just put them into the chat and Ankush can ask them at the end and we'll try and address them as best we can. So the quick introduction to Energy Elephant, so I don't ignore the elephant in the room, you're going to hear a lot of those puns, is that Energy Elephant is a software platform that helps organizations create, store, organize, analyze, report, and take action on their sustainability data, in particular around the areas of energy, waste, water, and carbon. They're kind of the key areas that we cover. And I suppose if we ask people to summarize what we do, we create a single source of truth for sustainability. And that comes up time and again from the organizations we work with. It's just a really simple to use software platform that helps organizations put this all together and then start to take an action on it. We use a forgets process because an elephant never forgets. And just should be a drum roll in the background there. And that follows this kind of sequence of getting data. So creating, finding, organizing, analyzing the data, getting insights from that data. So what is that information telling us? Getting the actions from that data. So what plans, projects, initiatives are we taking to deliver on the targets that we've set? And then finally getting the results. So meeting them and exceeding them smartly and on time, which is something that's coming up more and more. So as a kind of a high level introduction, what is sustainability? And I suppose one of the key kind of definitions that I've used over the years is the 1987 UN Brundtland Commission definition, which is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And it's very simple in theory and very difficult to do in practice. And obviously, you know, the use of fossil fuels and things like that falls under this, where, you know, if we use them today, they won't be available there for future generations to use. Hence why so many organizations are trying to move towards more renewable and cyclical sources for energy, etc. So why does it matter? The bad news is we have approximately 8 years to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 45% if we want to meet the 1.5 degree threshold that's been set at a kind of a UN level and a global level. And that's to protect the planet from a climate future that no one really wants to pass on to their children or future generations. And you can see how that ties in very strongly with the sustainability definition around not passing on our problems from today into the future to try and help them deal with it, etc. So I'm going to start with a challenge, and I'm not expecting anyone to actually answer this question on the chat or anything or on the feedback, but you know, what's the most sustainable option for an organization when it comes to drying your hands after a bathroom? So you can use reusable towels, fabric towels. You can use paper throwaway towels, or you can use an electric hand dryer. And the reason I ask this question is it's a really simple problem. It's like, if you're in a restaurant, or if you're a hotel, or if you're in an office block, like which of these ones do you use and which one is the most sustainable option for an organization? And I suppose the answer is there isn't a one-stop shop answer. And this is something that you'll see more and more when it comes to sustainability in particular, that there's a lot of interdependencies in there. So it depends on who's asking and what the scope is. So you can imagine for reusable towels, you need to wash them. There's hygiene issues. There's time issues. Someone has to go in, take them out, wash them, clean them, make sure they're clean, bring them back and put them up. The second option for paper towels is, there's waste generated. They're used once, they're thrown in a bin. Someone has to empty the bins. That bin waste could go to landfill, it could go to incineration, it could go to recycling. It just depends. And then the third option is the hand dryer, the electric hand dryer, and that's got obviously energy, usage. It's someone has to service it. There's embodied carbon in the actual electronic device that's put in, etc. It needs to be thought about. And I suppose it depends on who you asked which is the right answer. And if the energy manager was asked, they would say, well, if there's no hand dryer in there, I don't use any energy, so I prefer if you use the paper towels. If you ask the facilities and housekeeping, or whoever it is who collects the bins and empties the bins, they would say use the electric hand dryers because I don't have to empty the bins, I don't have to restock the paper, etc. And then if you asked the hotel manager or the office manager, etc., they might say, well, I prefer to have the reusable towels, more luxurious, they look better, it's a nicer feel, etc. And then the health and safety manager might come in and say, no, there's a risk there with bacteria, etc., or hygiene, etc. So it really does depend on who you ask, and it also depends on the scope of what you're looking for. So if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And you'll hear this, I hope, on pretty much every webinar that comes up about sustainability data. So data is the oil of the modern economy, and that's a horrible phrase to use because we're trying to reduce the use of oil, but it is something that's, we hear about data centers and how they're growing exponentially, that, data is being created all over the place at the moment. And there's just more and more of it. Every day, every month, every year, there's more and more data becoming available into the modern businesses and modern economy, etc. And I suppose if you're not using the data you already have, you probably don't need more of it. So my lesson one tip to organizations out there is to try and keep it simple. And we've seen this time and time again where organizations get the idea of getting stuck in, and the first thing they do is we want to get everything censored. We want to get everything collected. We want a bit of everything. We want to cover energy, waste, water, supply chain, materials, construction, everything. And then about 6 months later, they're sitting there in a room together going, do you know what? We've actually got nothing done. So because they've tried to bite off more than they can chew. So really the lesson one, I think, for most organizations is to keep it simple at the beginning in particular. So the types of sustainability data we're going to talk about today are the ones that we kind of help organizations with. And they're energy, number one. It's in the name of our organization, Energy Elephant. And that's electricity, heating fuels, and transport fuels. Direct greenhouse gas emissions, that could be from F-gases, cooling systems, etc., methane emissions, lots of other greenhouse gas sources that aren't energy related. Waste data, and I suppose we're going to talk briefly about, is it the disposal data or the collection data? So if you have a green bin that's collected, you can say I had 100% green waste, but if that green bin then gets segregated and half of it's spoilt or contaminated and needs to go to incineration or landfill, then is it really recycled? Should it be termed green recycled waste, or should it be split after the disposal route? Looking at water and water supply and water disposal, same thing, if water is just treated and then disposed of, or where it goes. And then carbon, and this is the elephant in the room to some extent. So scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3. And scope 3, I've put the little infinity symbol in there. And that's because for some organizations, it is literally almost infinite, the amount of information that you could be collecting when it comes to scope 3 emissions. So when it comes to data types that are out there, we try and simplify it down for organizations. And we think this is a kind of a good use case for most organizations. You've got 4 types of data that you're looking to capture and look at. You've got historic data, and that's typically years old. So that could be going back to your baseline years, could be going back further than that. It's really the data you have from older systems. It just tells you overall what you've used, what you've consumed, etc., if it's available. We then look at recent data, and that's probably something, data that's come in the last couple of weeks, months, potentially. It's usually in the last year, to be called recent. And that's kind of, it could be things like bills, it could be older meter readings, it could be invoices that have told you how much waste has been disposed of, etc. And that goes on to real-time and live data. And real-time and live data is something that more and more organizations are starting to get, in particular with the rollout of smart metering. So it's going to become more widespread and more available. And this data is, you can look up right now what's happening in a particular building or in a particular vehicle or in a particular asset, see how it's performing, etc. And then there's the future or projection data. And that's taking all these other data sources and maybe some other independent data sources and then projecting forward what are you going to use in the future? What's your target? How close are you to reaching that target that you've set for yourself in 2030, 2040, 2050? And it's usually built off the existing data sets. That's the other thing just to remember with that. The second thing to think about data is the data frequency. So when you're looking at the data and the data quality that you're collecting, is it a data set that you need to just collect once a year? And that could be by survey, it could be 1 meter reading, it could be 1 photo, it could be, 1 report. And that just tells you overall for the year, this is what's been used. It could be seasonal, if there's variance there and you want to track that, or quarterly. It could be monthly, and most organizations try to work to a monthly or quarterly kind of framework so they can see how they're progressing on a sustainability basis or on a carbon emission basis. But it could also be weekly, daily, hourly, per minute or per second or per millisecond in some instances. But it really depends on how quickly you need that information to make a judgment call on what you're going to do. And the example I always think of is if you're queuing in the airport and there's a time that tells it's going to be 12 minutes to get through security. If that updates every minute, that's fine. It's pretty up to date, it's pretty accurate. But if that only updates once an hour and you're in that queue and suddenly it goes from 12 minutes to 80 minutes or something because it only updates once an hour, that information isn't really useful for you when you're in that queue and you're about to miss your flight. So it really depends on how frequent you need that data based on the way you're going to act on the data that's been given back to you. So some of the data key challenges that we come across, as I mentioned previously, are around, do I need more data? And you can see there's a range of different frameworks you might be looking at. Could be ESG reporting, GRESB, CDP, ISO 50001. There's lots of different frameworks. Some are voluntary, some are mandatory. And obviously the elephant in the room is CSRD directive, which is the European Directive for Sustainability Reporting. And that's causing a huge amount of stress in the market because people don't really know what they're supposed to do yet. And people are trying to get things in order. And the thing is, the reporting starts next year, but it's for this year. So you need to be collecting the data. And I suppose the first thing is do you need more data? And as I said, if you're not using the data you already have, start with that. And the example I gave is something that we spoke to an organization back about a year and a half ago around vehicle fuel use. And they'd gone down this line of, we need this vehicle fuel use to know what our energy use is in the vehicle so we can report on it, on energy and on carbon. And their option was and there's a reason why this is so long, it was to retrofit in some hardware that needs some connectivity to get that information out of the hardware, back to the cloud, back to their dashboards, to show real-time fuel consumption, converting liters of fuel per hour against the distance traveled by the vehicle, tied to the particular driver at that time, and at the vehicle at that time, with a monthly check and review of the data to make sure the data was cleaned in time. There wasn't any data errors in removing spurious data and filling in any gaps if there was a data gap in the system because for whatever reason the thing didn't send out the signal or didn't capture it. And then the system needs to be annually calibrated and the system maintained, etc. And this project was turning into a monster for the organization. And when we looked at it with them, we were like, well, what do you need? Like, what do you need initially before you get into this really detailed confirmation area? And the option was, we need to know how far the vehicle traveled every year, and we need to know how much fuel that vehicle used. The solution to that was 1 photo of the dashboard of the vehicle at the beginning of each year, which told you the mileage from the odometer, and it told you the average liters per 100 kilometer that the vehicle had used in the previous 12-month period. And that gave you the information you needed. And it turned something that was very complex, very expensive, into something that was quick and easy to do. And it also meant that in the future, should they want to get into that real-time information from the vehicle, they could work on that on a phased basis, but it meant they met the criteria of what they needed at the time. So lesson 2 I've said is use what you have to start with where possible, and try and utilize the value of what you've already got there quickly and easily. Scope 3 greenhouse gas emission data is something that comes up again and again for organizations as well. So it's around, scope 1 is your, direct emissions from your own fuel usages and emission sources, etc. Scope 2 is the emissions based on the electricity or heating or cooling network that you're connected to. In Ireland, it's primarily electricity. There is more and more district heating, and that would fall under scope 2 as well. And then scope 3 is kind of everything else that you don't have direct control of to some extent. And that could be for your water use, your waste, your staff and business travel, which includes flights and things, could be leased assets and franchises, etc. And it can be a very, very difficult area to get your head around. And because it impacts so many different aspects of the business, it's really hard for organizations to do this, and they usually sit down with consultants to kind of scope out exactly what they're going to do. Again, this is just an example of some of the other greenhouse gas emission sources for scope 3 that we've seen organizations starting to collect or think about. And it's business travel, employee commuting, assets that they own, transport and distribution, waste and recycling, use of products. So if you're creating a product, what happens to that product at the end of its life? So downstream as well as upstream. Outsourced services is something that I think organizations sometimes don't even realize that they have. So if you've got large kind of grass areas and you don't have your own lawnmower or lawn mowing team to go out there and cut the grass every few days, and you have someone else who comes in and does that for you, they're probably using energy to do that. So if they weren't doing it for you, you'd be doing it yourself, and the energy use would be attributable to yourself. But obviously, because it's outsourced, it's a scope 3 emission, but you should still be thinking about that, because obviously it has an impact on the environment, etc. Investments and financing, this is more on the kind of banking side and the finance side, where you're putting your money to work and seeing what that work's actually producing. Embodied carbon is one that a lot of organizations are thinking about as well now. So like, what is the embodied carbon of the materials that are going into the buildings that they're building or the products that they're making? And then one that, again, like I mentioned, it's in the news every single day now, is data centers and cloud data center usage, and the explosion in energy use in data centers, because of all the different software services that we're now starting to use and grow. And, as I said, an infinite amount of data coming in now, and services that are being done on those cloud services. So again, it's something that's it's top of mind for the data centers, and we work with some around how they capture that data and analyze that data and improve on it. But again, it's one of those ones that, because there's such growth in the market, it's a really difficult one, and you need to be thinking about it from your own perspective if you're using those services. This is we created a thing called the Smart Energy Traffic Light, which was taking data from the grid and trying to put it into something that's simple to understand. And this is kind of trying to get organizations to think a little bit about their electricity data outside of total kilowatt hours used per year or per month. And the idea with this is essentially it's almost as important when you use electricity as it is how much electricity you use. And that's kind of counterintuitive. You think if you reduce your electricity consumption, you're reducing your energy, you're reducing your emissions. But that isn't always the case if you're not thinking about the carbon in a variable dynamic kind of way, in particular for electricity. So this is just a snapshot from Ireland. And you can see that, at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, the amount of wind electricity being generated was about 11 to 15% of all the electricity being generated in Ireland. And that meant that the rest of it was essentially being conventionally generated with gas, potentially with coal, and then with other sources as well. But you can see then later in the day, when it gets to about 9 o'clock onwards, suddenly you're up to over 50% of all the electricity being generated by renewable sources, in particular wind in Ireland. And more you'd see this with solar PV as well starting to come onto the grid. But essentially wind is the primary renewable generator in Ireland. So if you've got an electric vehicle and you need 3 hours to charge it up, if you charged it at 1 o'clock that morning for 3 hours, you would have got probably around about 15% renewables into the energy mix in your vehicle. If you charged it up later that evening at, let's say, 9 o'clock till midnight, you would have got well over 50% renewables into that mix. And this is something that organizations may not need to measure yet, but they should be conscious of, because if you're making an investment decision in technologies, you want the investment decision to take account of, you may need to start reporting on your carbon on a 15-minute basis or a half-hourly basis, as opposed to just once a year, which is how most organizations currently do it. And most of the leading indications globally are this is the way most methodologies are going to get to, because there is such variance in the carbon emissions for electricity on an hour-by-hour basis. So this idea of having a carbon number for electricity that's for the whole year doesn't really stack up in the real world when you look at the emission factors changing every hour. In particular in Ireland, because we have so much intermittent renewable generation on the system, and we're one of the global leaders in this area. So the next section I'm looking at is how do you think about your data? And it's like the plan, do, check, act system of any good management system. The ISO system, the International Standards Organization system, is always based on this plan, do, check, act, repeat, plan, do, check, act, repeat. And it's a cycle. It's a good way of thinking when it comes to, energy use, water use, waste generation, carbon emissions, all these other things. And I suppose that the lesson I've put down is, however beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at the results. And that means that no matter how good the plans are for all the things you're doing, you should always look at the data coming out telling you whether you've actually delivered on what you thought you were going to deliver on. And you can see this in some organizations where they updated their lighting to LEDs. What they found was that while the electricity use went down, their greenhouse gas emissions actually went up, because the old lighting was essentially heating the building. When they removed that heat, they needed to use more gas or heating oil to heat the building, because the electricity waste heat was no longer there. And again, that ties back to what we said about scope. Like if your scope is just electricity and it's LED lighting, you should also be looking at, well, is the waste heat from those lights we're going to replace doing anything beneficial? And if it is or isn't, that's good or bad. And then if it isn't, what's going to compensate that? Is it going to be the heating system, and what's the heating system using to power the heating or cooling in that particular building? So again, like there's lots of things around this that you need to look at the scope of your system, but also look at the results of what you're getting out on the far side. So moving on to the core part of the presentation then is around data, the good. And I suppose for most organizations, when we were speaking to them to begin with, very, very few fall under the good. And this is fairly typical for most organizations, especially starting out. So if you're not in the good bucket or good category, don't feel bad about it, because you're in the vast majority of organizations out there if you're falling into other buckets. And I suppose what good data looks like is it's 100% data coverage. So there's no gaps, there's no missing data. You've got everything you need in that data set. And you're not worried about, having, estimated data in there or anything like that. Second thing is data quality. There's no misread data. There's no transcript errors. There's no, decimal places in the wrong place. We've seen all sorts of weird and wonderful things, but essentially the quality of that data is impeccable. There's no problems with it. You're happy with the coverage and you're happy with the quality. And then the third one kind of stems from those two previous ones, and it's, the data is auditable and verified. And this is something, especially under CSRD, organizations are starting to now have to get this third-party verification that the data is, as close to 100% coverage and 100% quality as possible, with the usual kind of, there might be some factor of safety error or something in there as well. But again, having somebody else verify that information is correct. The data should be easily accessible to the right people at the right time. So if you're the water manager, you can access the water data when you need it. If you're the energy manager, you can access the energy data. If you're the procurement officer, you can get in and see the cost data. You can see all this information whenever you need it without having to go through a kind of a long process to get information and access to it. And then all useful insights are highlighted and acted on, which sounds simpler than it is, but something comes up in the information that tells you to do something, someone does it, and you get the beneficial result out of doing that action. And the data is easy to understand. There isn't any ambiguous data in there that people are unsure of or not sure of how it works, etc. And they need to think about those things from that side. And generally speaking, good quality data is easier for smaller data sets, and smaller data sets tend to be in smaller organizations, smaller companies. But also in big organizations, they might be kind of packaged into small data sets that are easier to kind of manage and make sure they're 100% correct. And we see that with some organizations, they'll start with energy data, or electricity data, and then they'll move on to thermal fuel data like gas, heating oil, etc. Then they might move on to the biofuels, renewables, solar PV, and then they might move on to the water data, and then they might move on to their waste data, and then they might move on to their travel and transport data. But they do it piece by piece because that's the best way to make sure they're getting everything they need and being able to act on it, etc. So the ideal is sustainability data is created at the point of contact, almost live, and fed back to an interpretable metric unit that the team can automatically act on. And what we see in this in the future as well is, in particular with kind of auto systems, some of these things will just automatically occur. So the temperature in the building goes down to a particular threshold, the system will automatically kick on to get the temperature back up, or the CO2 level of air quality in the building will change, and it'll compensate automatically without any outside interference or work required to do that. And I suppose lesson 4 I put in is always do a sanity check on it. So stand back from the data, get out of the, try to see the wood from the trees, and look at the data and go, look, does this make common sense? And I suppose the area we see this is like, you look at the carbon footprint on a per meter squared basis for your buildings. And there was one particular building that was out and out the best by far. It was like 99% less carbon per meter squared than any of the other buildings in the portfolio. And there were 100 plus buildings in this portfolio. And we went back and said, there's something unusually good about this particular building. Why is it so particularly good? And it turned out that there was a decimal place in the wrong place. So the numbers that were being used to calculate the energy use for that particular site, someone had mistranscribed the decimal place by 2. So instead of it being 100 or 1,000, they'd made it 100. And it just meant that particular building, and if you just looked at the data from the data's point of view, you would have said, this all looks fine, there's no problem there. But standing back from the data and looking at it and going, this looks too good to be true, it's always worth doing a sanity check on your data before you go into any depth on it. Okay, the second part then is the bad. And I suppose the bad could be described as unknown unknowns, which is a well-known phrase at this stage. But like, you know what you know, and you know what you don't know. And then what you don't know that you don't know is the stuff that's dangerous. Lots of gaps in the data. And this could be, someone switched supplier and they don't have their old supplier's data, or, someone was doing this, the person moved on, new person came in, took a couple of months to get up to speed, and suddenly there's a gap there from the data. Different suppliers, different things. They were, there's lots of reasons why there can be gaps in the data. Data siloed into impenetrable systems is something that comes up, especially when it comes to building management systems and older BMS systems. So the data is there, but nobody can get it out or use it apart from on, the computer that was installed on, potentially in the older buildings, etc. Or access is denied. So users can't access the data they need, in particular for sustainability, because sustainability is a fairly new topic for organizations. So we hear this a lot where, someone's been hired as the chief sustainability officer and they're getting stuck in and they're trying to get access to everything. And it's like, there's 5 or 6 different people who have the data in different areas, and it's kind of on a need to know basis. So they don't share. And that can be very frustrating for a person, but also for an organization where they're trying to get these things done and get actions taken. So some of the examples I've mentioned already. So data overlaps is another one where someone gets a summary bill in that covers 6 months, but there's already 6 months of data of bills there, and organizations will sometimes double count it because they don't realize that summary bill is actually already covered by the other bills that are there, and they'll pay it twice sometimes in some instances as well. Or the other thing we've seen is where people switch supplier and you have 2 different electricity suppliers invoicing for the same meter point for a long period of time, until the older supplier is told to stop invoicing because they're no longer the supplier. And then there's obviously, if that's identified, they can reclaim the money from the older supplier, etc. But again, these things happen in the real world, and sometimes they're difficult to spot. Estimated meter readings comes up all the times. I put in for 3,000 days because I think one of the worst case scenarios we saw was where there was a meter that had been estimated for 3,000 days for the organization. That estimate isn't really telling you anything because no one has any idea how much energy has been used in that meter if it's been estimated for 3,000 days. And in the other one we came across was the water usage for a retail organization in Southeast Asia, and they were looking at the data, and the data looked very similar. Every time we looked at it, it was the same each year. And we went back and said, well, what is the metering like in these sites? And it turned out that there were no meters. There was just a pipe, and that the on-site person said it's a 12-inch pipe. The flow rate through that pipe is estimated to be this much, and that's how much water we use every year. So again, pure guesstimation, very, very little tangible information there. And then KPIs as well. So looking at how you can tie KPIs together to the, if you tie your energy or you start carbon KPIs to profits in particular, profits can go up and down very quickly without having any impact on your carbon emissions or your energy use. And COVID was where we saw this happen in a big, big way, where organizations were using metrics, and then COVID hit and offices were shut down. But there was no one in the office, so they might have been using the number of people in the building every day, but there was very few people in the building every day. But the energy use was pretty much the exact same because the building was still operational and still being heated and cooled, etc. So lesson 5 is it ain't what you know that gets you into trouble; it's what you know for sure. It just ain't so. And so again, always think about that when you're looking at the data, and I'm always kind of trying to do devil's advocate about the data. So finally, the ugly. So most businesses are too busy to collect sustainability data, or they have higher priorities. And this is something that comes up all the time, that organizations, especially small businesses, they're like, look, I've so many other things. I've got staff pressures, I've got payroll, I've got stock take, I've got my rent renegotiations, whatever it is. And like sustainability days, I really love to do it, but it's just not on my to-do list today. And that's the problem, I suppose, for a lot of organizations, is trying to get time to do some of this stuff. And then finally, the other side of it is sometimes data can be counterintuitive. And I mentioned that as well, just that sometimes you see the data, you think one thing, but actually you need to think about it a bit more detailed because it might not actually be telling you what you think it's telling you. And this is an example of what I mean by ugly data in particular. So there was an organization, and they needed to report on the energy use for their properties, but they didn't have any access to any metering or billing for the buildings because they're all sublet or rented out. So what they did was they said, okay, well, we know the energy rating for the building. We know it's an A-rated building or a B-rated building. And that tells us we use 50 kilowatt hours per meter squared. Our average building size is this, multiply it out, and we get our number for kilowatt hours. And I suppose the interesting thing is, if you look at the actual data for any of the sites where they got the actual data, it was always way off, like significantly out. This is actually from 2022 CSO data for Ireland, and it shows you the electricity consumption, the mean electricity consumption for buildings. And what I thought was very interesting on this was the A-rated and B-rated buildings use significantly more electricity than the C, the D, or the E, or the F, which is counterintuitive. And the reason that happens is a number of different reasons. First one being, newer buildings that are A or B rated tend to be much, much larger. So this is just, again, from the CSO data around mean floor areas by type of building. You see community day centers that are A or B rated are twice as big, and same in retail. They're more than twice as big of the F and the G rated stores. So they're definitely going to use more energy because they're bigger. The second thing then is that the electricity use in a modern A or B rated building tends to be much higher because they might be using electricity for heating, not gas. So therefore electricity would be higher. But also they tend to have a lot more lighting, a lot more electrical infrastructure. They might have, other plug-in loads that you just wouldn't have in an older building. So again, using those kind of proxies for data sometimes are counterintuitive when you actually get the real data and compare them. So that's what I mean by sometimes it's counterintuitive when you look at that information. The other one is around smart meter data. So this is something that organizations are going to get more and more of if they don't have it already. So the electricity meters in Ireland, most of them are now being upgraded to smart meters, or will be very soon. And the smart meter essentially tells you every 15 minutes, every half hour, how much electricity you've used. So organizations are starting to get access to this data. A lot of organizations don't even realize it's there yet. But it shows you every 15 minutes, let's say, what the energy use is in a building. And this is one where the bill every month for the organization changed. And when we looked at the data, as you can see here in the middle, the data was actually, the meter was broken. And what the system did was when the meter broke, it just put in a weekly cycle that repeated and repeated. So whenever you look at a data set as a data engineer or a data scientist, and you see this perfectly aligned data set in the middle, that generally speaking is not real world data. The real world data is messy, and you can see it afterwards where it gets really messy and jumps around the place a lot. And that's a functioning meter point. Where you see this perfect kind of line going all the way across is very, very unusual, especially when it comes to electricity consumption, because different things get turned on at different times, different days, different times of the year, whether it's hot or cold, whether it's busy or quiet, etc. So but the organization hadn't even spotted this because the bills changed every month. And that was the first thing the CFO said to us when they looked at this data was that, well, our bills go up or down every month. Why are they going up or down every month when the meter readings are exactly the same? And the reason the bills went up or down every month was because it depended on the number of days in a month. So it went up or down because there were more or less days in a month. And also depending on the days of the week that were in the month. So if there was less usage on the weekend, if every month had exactly the same number of days and exactly the same number of weekdays, Monday to Sunday, then it would have been the exact same. But that doesn't happen on a kind of a bill basis. So there's still variance in the bills, which means you think the bills are actually telling you what's there, but actually when you looked at the data, it wasn't. So the other things we've come across then are, data being used, spend data being used for carbon emissions from flights. Everyone knows flight prices vary greatly between different airlines, between different times, etc. That doesn't always be a good proxy for your carbon emissions. Using offsets, insets, removal, green energy certificates. Again, this is an area that's getting a lot of attention at the moment. What's a good offset? What's a bad offset? What's a valuable offset? What's additional, etc. And it's something that's just going to be talked about more and more. And it's a very, very difficult to actually kind of see it. For an organization to say, I'm 100% green because I have all these green certs. Where do these green certs come from? They came from this location in sub-Saharan Africa or somewhere. And it's like, well, is there any certification that says that this is actually valid, that's additional, etc. There's a lot of complexity in that particular area. Closed sites. So we've seen this where organizations have sites they've closed down. So they've said, yeah, no more energy data for that site. And then we start seeing large energy bills coming through for closed sites. And it's turned out that the electricity for that particular site was also connected to the neighboring building, and the neighboring building was using it. No one realized they were meant to be paying electricity bills, apparently. Or reducing nighttime electricity use led to increased gas bills. And I mentioned this about LED lighting upgrades, where the heating load was removed because the lighting was gone, and suddenly the gas bills went up because they had to heat the building. So lesson 6 was your scope matters. So really focus on it and set it wisely. So with that, I'm going to open the mic for James to jump on and just do an introduction to himself, if that's okay.
Hey folks, James here. Very good, very interesting, Joe. There you had some very good thoughts there. Yeah, and sure, we've been kind of working together there for a bit over the last 12, 18 months, and tis a journey on this. We're kind of on this journey now with a while. So yeah, very, very, very interesting.
Cool. Thanks, James. I suppose just as a kind of discussion point to begin with, like, how important is it for you guys to have timely data or real-time data, or does it depend on what you're reporting?
Yeah, great question. Very important, Joe. Obviously, it depends on what we're reporting, and it depends on the kind of stakeholders you're engaging with. So, at a kind of a very senior level, your kind of data over a period of time or monthly kind of data and trends is very important. So the kind of senior management and your CEO and CFO can see we're going in the right direction, and we're kind of aligning our KPIs. But what kind of we found very important is, particularly, look, we're quite a high energy user. Our processes are very energy intensive. So to kind of really start to probably, I suppose, focus the business and focus the operations and the production team around their role here, or the importance or their awareness on their energy usage and the whole sustainability side, getting that data to them as quickly as we can in a very kind of simple format that's quick to digest means, they can tie that very quickly into how the plant has performed. So, for example, they know what they were producing yesterday. They can get their data around it the following morning, and then they can kind of see, okay, was there something what happened yesterday to maybe change that performance or to drive that higher energy usage, or is there something happening? Something simple even from the engineering. So it's really kind of the production or the maintenance team. Is there, for example, a leak somewhere, or is there something happening? Why are we seeing that trend? So the sooner you can get that to them people that can impact it, and in as timely as manner as possible, the sooner you can address it.
Cool. Thanks, James. And when you're looking at data, what are you looking for when it comes to being auditable, or the auditability of the data?
Yeah, and I think you touched on it there, but kind of simply put, you're looking for that independent third-party verification. So, for example, for electricity, you're looking for an invoice. I think you mentioned around, was it 3,000 days or something around the water meter, was it, Joe? There was a very high number there, but again,
for you guys, luckily, yeah.
if you use a meter, meter reading as well, so that independent, it's not an estimate. Ultimately, you kind of want to move away from estimates, and it's a system generated third party verified number. That's really what you're looking for, and as much control and rigor around that. But ultimately, that's it. How can you support the data you're presenting or you're using?
It's kind of gold standards. And how do you use comparable data for metrics and benchmarks, I suppose, to compare different sites against each other?
Yeah, that's always drives a good debate. Something I kind of had to spend a bit of time initially myself when I was trying to understand this. For example, take natural gas. So I had engineers talking to me in meters cubed, I had engineers talking to me in terms, and I had engineers talking to me in kilowatts. So to begin with, even there, now they're all usable. So a lot of it is trying to get that just one uniform. So if we're talking maybe around energy usage, we're talking kilowatts. Trying to get that one unit, and then kind of for comparable across sites or across plants. You'll get into different vagaries, because if you're producing different products, you will range in what your energy consumption is. But if we've kind of tied it very much around our output, a production output. So again, a number that can be verified, can be understood, the production guys know. And then what you're kind of saying, okay, if I'm on this product, this is what I've kind of done in the past, the level of energy I've used. So I was on this product yesterday, why is my energy gone up? So trying to compare when you're on that product, as opposed to move away the discussion, well, that's just product mix. And that's just because I'm drawing a different product than I was yesterday. My energy is still very good. And you're trying to just go, well, actually, no, when you were drawing that product or producing that product 12 months ago, your energy level was here, and now you're up here. So it's trying to, I suppose, keep as comparable as possible and take away as much debate as you can, and try to drive that conversation then into what can we do about it, rather than having 20-30 minutes debating the accuracy of the number, or that's not valid. Let's change that conversation and go, okay, how can we move the needle towards improving that? We've a baseline set now, we've established our performance, and how can we start to improve it?
Great stuff, thanks. Are there any future sustainability data sets you think organizations should be thinking about now?
Yeah, there's you touched a lot there on the scope 3. So that is, and I suppose this whole area and this whole focus on sustainability, is, asking those questions. I think, there's a lot of people, including myself, I'm learning every day around this, or I'm, looking at performance, or looking at things in a different lens. I think that's kind of been a big thing over the last 12, 24 months, is you're evaluating performance in that different type of lens, or that different view, bring a different dimension. I think the scope 3, Joe, is definitely one that's is one that people need to maybe just start to understand to begin with, and then see, how you're going to measure it. I think, your scope 1 and 2, and you probably, but I think they're easier to understand and define. It's the scope 3 is grayer the right term? I'm not too sure, but there's a lot more involved in it. There's a lot more involved in that space. So I think the key is for people to just start engaging in it, and start understanding it, and start understanding what scope 1, what scope 2, what scope 3.
Yeah, and I suppose my final kind of question to you was, if you could recommend one thing for companies starting their sustainability journey, what would it be?
Oh, to start. to just start. This is what's it. I think you might use the pun about the elephant, but I kind of leverage it again. But it's like, one bite at a time. If you don't start, it becomes so big, and it becomes, again, hard to. It becomes too difficult, and you'll keep park it, and you'll keep just put it to the side. Whereas I think really it's just to begin, and I think you touched on it there as well, Joe, just around use the data you have. You'll be surprised at the amount of data you do have. Existing data, try to capture it, like ourselves, we've kind of leveraged eJO to kind of capture the one simple system that's kind of very user friendly, and get people engaged in it. And, get that started. And from there, you'll be surprised how you can progress.
Cool. Thanks, James. Appreciate that. I'm going to hand back to Ankush and stop sharing the slides. Hopefully there's a couple of questions there, Ankush.
Right. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, James. That was very informative. And of course, you touched on a couple of areas there about Scope 3 and CSRD, Joe. And we have a couple of questions on the Scope 3, and we'll touch base there, and we will take those questions. But no, thanks for going through all that information about having that tangible data for companies to make those informed decisions, I suppose, and also about the frequency and data age. And I know there's a lot of information. We'll now share the slides with all the attendees, and also the webinar recording. But like you mentioned, the new directives and regulations, such as Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and that will be driving sustainable procurements in the supply chains, I suppose. And also it will kind of become a standard for large companies to develop their sustainability strategy. And also the micro businesses probably will look at those draft standards to develop their sustainability strategy. And within that CSRD, now companies will be looking at probably more than 1,400 data points, and will have to report on different environmental factors, whether it's energy, water, marine sources, and resource use. So, like just for and I'll pick up at the last point where James left us to start your journey. For many companies that are very early stage of their sustainability journey, what do you think the first step in terms of like you mentioned using your current data sets or data you have? So is it about carrying out that energy audit, identify those energy hotspot and emissions and cost saving opportunities? And I'll tie in another questions from our audience there, from Dylan. And he says that I know sustainability is quite relevant to different organizations, but in general, what would you say would be the KPI for an SME to track regarding the sustainability? So if you can just reflect on that, Joe.
Thanks, Ankush. Yeah, I'll start with the second question first, which is the KPI, because it's an interesting one. I suppose every organization should be looking at greenhouse gas emissions to some extent, and looking at carbon as one of their core kind of KPIs when it comes to sustainability. There's lots and lots of other good ones around, biodiversity, etc. as well. But I think one of the core ones is carbon, and the benefit of that is it can tie into your energy, your waste, your water, your supply chain. It covers an awful lot of what you're going to be looking at as an organization. So I think having a carbon metric is a good one to start with, and looking at, is that going to be driven by activity? So is it the total carbon, which you should definitely be tracking and trying to reduce, but also if you're growing very fast, are you growing in a sustainable and efficient way? So I think by just measuring it and reporting on it, you'll suddenly start thinking about it in the longer term strategy things as well. And then when it comes to what do you start with, the first question, I think, like James was saying there, like start with what you have. Every organization has some data, whether that's, their electricity bills or their water metering or their invoices from things they've purchased, etc. Start with something and build off it. Like you definitely do want to think of it as like building with Lego bricks, as in you want to do little brick by brick as you're going. Because that's the most likely way you'll get success. And also engaging all the stakeholders. Like it's really hard if someone at the top just says everyone has to do it, or if someone at the very bottom goes, I'm going to start this little initiative. You kind of want to get everyone on board and bring them through.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the importance of having the data about your baseline and measuring the data going forward, and also the complexities around scope 3 emissions. We have a question there from Niall. For calculating scope 3 emissions, one of the methods seems to be a spend-based calculation where the financial value of a purchased goods or services is multiplied by an emission factor. Can you elaborate on the possible sources of this emission factor? So I'll just quickly answer that one, Niall. We actually hosted the webinar around Scope 3 emissions earlier in March. So if you can refer to that webinar, a lot of the different categories about Scope 3 emissions were covered. Sector-specific emission factors and also supplier-specific emission factors are covered in that webinar there. Joe, do you think you want to add something to that, or?
Yeah, I suppose it's the best place to start is to use spend-based emission factors initially, but I would always say the longer term goal should be trying to tie it back to what you can actually change. Like I said about purchasing flights, like looking at how much you spent on flights is not a good indicator for how much carbon you've emitted from those flights. If you've got an all-you-can-eat flight deal, which I've heard about recently, where you can fly for as much as you want for a couple £100 every month, that's not going to tell you your carbon emissions versus actually tracking the individual flight backwards and forwards for each kind of for each travel case. And I know for some organizations, even looking at that information can be useful for other non-sustainability reasons around efficiency. And, if people are spending a lot of time traveling backwards and forwards to states or to, further jurisdictions, is it the best use of their time to be doing that every month or every couple of weeks? Or could they do things more efficiently and say, look, if we have this centralized meeting every year and we can bring everyone together for that one thing, it might be better from a carbon emissions point of view, but it also might be better from a business point of view because people aren't jet lagged and wrecked from traveling. Anyone who's been to the airports recently will understand what I'm saying when it comes to stuff like that. And I'm sure, James, I don't know if you want to jump in on any of your stuff that you've kind of thought about on the Scope 3 side.
No, I think that covers it well, Joe. It's kind of just as you get into it, it's adding that extra layers. That's a real kind of nice example around, the air flight, that could be €200, but could cover 10,000 kilometers, that kind of the difference. It's probably that understanding of what's the real driver. So you'll have the cost and that gets you started and you capture that data and at least you have a format, and then you can start to ask the further questions on then around, well, how is that really capturing the kilometers? Once you identify and categorize it to begin with, you can start to build from there. So I think that's a very nice example. I can't think of a better example now than that. But I think the concept of, you have to start somewhere. So start with the spend and start with the categorization, and then you can build from there to really understand it. Like you're kind of a good one, Joe. Like we kind of looking just in bit separate now to Scope 3, but for example, energy and carbon targets and absolute carbon targets. And our discussion and our thought process is open that efficiency alone won't get us there. we need to do something different around our energy source to meet absolute carbon. So again, it's a journey. You know, we were tied very much around efficiency, 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 but then you can only go so far there to get an absolute carbon reduction. You need to do something different with your fuel source. So again, it's that kind of journey, I think, isn't it? Really, you kind of understand your data set, you get asking the questions, and then you know the target. You set a target of where you need to get to, and then you try to figure out how you move the needle there.
Great. We probably can have time for one more question there. Joe, so it's specifically for you, how would you suggest measuring growth versus carbon emissions? Would this be a time when revenue would be used?
Oh, sorry, could you repeat that one, Ankush?
Yeah. So how would you suggest measuring growth versus carbon emissions? Would this be a time when revenue would be used as an indicator?
Yeah, I suppose even if you're growing, you should be looking to grow with zero emissions, because that's what you're going to have to do in the future at some point. So you should have a KPI that allows you to see, like James has mentioned, around the absolute emissions as well as your KPI. And I suppose the other thing to remember with KPIs is you can always change your KPI at some point if you find a better one. And we've seen that with a number of organizations where we'll track maybe 4 or 5 KPIs. They'll have their core KPI that they report on to management, but they'll have 3 or 4 sub ones that they're just testing to see if they actually are better aligned with what they're doing. But the absolute emissions is something that eventually organizations will need to try and get to tackle. And I suppose what James was saying there, you do kind of have those small steps and giant leaps to get to where you want to get to.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, James. So Joe, I'll just share my screen. I just have a couple of slides and we'll finish with those. So about today's webinar, like I mentioned, we will be sharing the slides and the webinar recording. So just in terms of our upcoming webinars, we have 3 more webinars in the series. So for next week, we will be hosting the webinar around social sustainability, how to implement the responsible business practices. So you can join that webinar next Wednesday from 1 to 2 p.m. And for the following weeks, you can see the schedule. We have a webinar to prioritize your sustainability issues and business case for biodiversity. And like I mentioned, our previous webinars, including that scope 3 emissions, or also someone was asking question about sustainability reporting. So we have covered those topics in that big list you can see there on your screen. So definitely have a look at those webinars if you have any questions. And of course, reach out to us at green@enterprise.com for any more information, if you need any further information. But I'd definitely like to take this moment to thank Joe and James for that wonderful session there. Thank you so much, all the audience, for joining us today. And we look forward to have you on our next webinars. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks, guys.